Good evening, this is Peter Mangelsdorf. This is CS338 final project titled InStructEd. So I have it currently hosted on the cs.drexel.edu user pages, and it's embedded in iframe here. And what this is we'll go ahead and maximize this window here, it is a JSON viewer. And originally what this is supposed to do is be this very rich kind of set of controls for making changes to a JSON structure. In this case, this is a dictionary, which then points to several smaller individual dictionaries, which each have different key value fields. This one's a list, as denoted by the dots. These are just strings that you can click on and edit. The idea is that you'd be able to copy and delete these things, or undo changes if you didn't like it, or delete the node altogether, and do other things like adjust the view, adjust the way the items are displayed, and get help on things, including some different windows. But there have been some difficulties with that, and I just ran out of time to implement a lot of that. These icons here are for adjusting the camera, but at the moment just use the scroll bars. If you want to see what this file looks like, it looks like this file here. And I'll put this here on the left and this one on the so that way you can see it. But here we have the metadata section, which then points title, date, and tags. And what I originally wanted to do with this was make a nicer interface to editing a large JSON document. So in this case, we can see the matrix here of values. And the reason for this is that I found that editing JSONs by hand was always very annoying. But I found YAML files, which is a similar kind of file format, just with some different changes, to be much easier to edit from a text editor, with things like demotion, promotion, and changing types. But I thought that when you start getting to very complex, very deeply nested YAML files, it becomes very difficult to edit. That's what I want to try and do with this editor. Now, I think I made the appearance of it bearable, but there's a lot of functionality in it that's just not quite working. So to really quickly go through the tech though that was used, obviously I was using VS Code here, but to get help on anything, I put together a really detailed README and architecture notes. I posted all the code on GitHub. And if we go through this here, this just talks about getting it started. A couple of these images aren't in here. I just didn't have time to do all that. But if we look at the architecture and the credits files, those will tell us the most about it. What I'm currently doing with it, though, is I'm hosting the code on GitHub. The application itself is having a lot of difficulty uploading it just straight up to the Drexel user pages. For whatever reason, they don't really like WebAssembly, so I ended up hosting it on itch. So I'll show you how that works. And the tool used, as I talked in here at some point, I think I'll talk about it here in the credits, is I used Godot. And the reason being for this is it provides a really nice way of interacting with the with UI components and building composable software. And it allows you to export to the web. This iframe is completely unnecessary. You don't need to host it on itch. I'll show you in a moment that you can run it entirely just from a simple HTML file. And there's some other software links and stuff that I put in here if anything is especially confusing. Now, as for the architecture and the implementation, I can go over this later. But the reason why I really want to go with Godot is it has this notion of objects, scripts, and resources. It allows for you to really compose things, and I think in a much stronger manner than just plain HTML. But as far as how the code is organized, I wanted this primary concept of a cursor here, which would put all these control items around an element, and then the editor itself would be all these separate controls off on the sides of it that you could use for doing complex manipulations. Like, I really wanted to mess around with promotion and demotion, and this idea of like mapping items between levels of abstraction, but that was way too complicated, and it's not. There's not very much documentation on it or widely published literature. Some other things I tried implementing were these tooltips. I wanted to make them a little bit more interactive, as I'll talk about here in help, but it's just not very thorough. I think I talked about it on the GitHub page as well, but one of the softwares uses Firebase for logging in. The profile management does have logging in and out, but it's just not quite working. And I'll show you how that's set up on Google Firebase. And the view, I wanted to make the view a lot more dynamic than just these scroll bars. Part of that was generating this JSON this structured document from a JSON, and that it loads it and it builds it out of these components. So if we look at these field values here, this chevron is indicative of a mapping of string to arbitrary text, and depending upon the type of a thing, it'll change it. So in this case, a URL, you can actually click on it to load it. I tried getting images to load, but I just ran out of time. I wanted to do other things like include a calendar instead of a date and do other kinds of interesting dynamic selections. And then this here, this really weird looking structure, this is a list of maps of lists of maps. You can think of this as being similar to XML. And again, I just wanted to make this as pleasant to look at and manipulate. Okay, so that's the code. I can open the app in a second to show you some other interesting things. I took one too many a note, and if you want to investigate like why this project's not like complete, I've listed out a lot of stuff. I think I severely underestimated the complexity of it. Let's see here. So it's just a place for you to publish things. I just used it because I knew it works, and I was looking quickly to try and get it published. All right. And I also implemented this pop-up because for the networking, what I wanted to do is have the document synced. I was looking at things like Google Keep, which is this very nice kind of note-taking application. I'll just pull up some images of it. And I liked using it. And what it does is it has this very nice display of items and what it does is it does these incremental updates. If you ever look at the licensing for Google Keep, they use some very, at the time I underappreciated the complexity of the networking that they do, but they do very incremental edits to documents. I tried doing something similar with Google Firebase, but I found it's just easier to sync the entire document. So on closing it, it'll ask it to leave so it has enough time to synchronize the document. So Godot is itself an editor. Unlike other UI frameworks, as I showed earlier with code, all the files are stored as plain text. So if we were to look at any of the classes here, so like the app itself is just plain text. Or if you're looking at one of the script files, it's this very lightweight Pythonic kind of a language. So you don't need Godot to browse this application to look at it, but I'll still open it in Godot so you can see it. And so here's like the main editor and application. And if we look over here on the scene tree, this is kind of like an HTML tree, but it's static. We can edit these things. And so we have these scenes and scripts. So we have the document itself, which is this very large. And as you can see over here, these are all also made of scenes. We have map items to map containers with list items and so on. And this is all generated from the JSON. And my original intent was to make this such that you could flip these and change the appearance, but just generating this document by itself was a little bit tricky. And then there's actual window controls and scripting for all that. If you're going to browse through this, I'd recommend looking at the experiment folder. The rest of these just mostly contain empty files, as I was kind of in a rush to try and get